So do you see any downsides to these groups?
Sure. I think one of the reasons that AA, I say AA is the model, and I think it's clearly the dominant model, uh, but it's maybe not accurate to say it's the only model. There have also been, consciousness raising groups that have influenced the way that a lot of these groups have been shaped. In Latin America in the 60s and 70s. Obviously, the base communities that the Catholic Church ran, which were often sort of dominated by people with leftist and Marxist sort of orientations, who tried to develop class consciousness. And I think more contemporarily, there's a lot of different kinds of group therapy, like this group that I studied that was facilitated by therapists. So, in many ways, those groups think of themselves as improving upon 12 steps, or maybe they wouldn't say improving upon, they'd say something like doing something totally different because that's crap. So I don't want to oversimplify and say they're all just doing 12 step. It's just that it has been so popular and so successful in growing in Latin America, and it has created these gender segregated models where you can create a separate kind of intense sociality that it's been, that just, I would say, I don't want to simplify that either, because there are mixed gender groups. But the idea, like you were saying, it's more that people will look for a place where they can identify with other people. It's more about the mutual identification and the way that sometimes gender segregation allows that. So I would say, yeah, there are probably definitely a lot of criticisms of the 12-step model in particular. And in a way, these groups see themselves as either improving or superseding entirely what's going on there. But when the research that I've seen on this and that I had to look into for my dissertation suggests that a lot of the reasons why perhaps some of these groups work has less to do with the content and more to do with like social network effects. And I'm not really qualified to judge that, but the idea just being that you leave a social network and you join a new one, and you tend to have your behavior and all kinds of other things fall into line with this new social group. On the whole, if you're looking at these aggregate rates of how often do people stick with X. So yeah, I don't know really how to judge, the quality of the 12 steps strategy like myself. I'm definitely not qualified to do that, but it just seems like that's been one of the main models. I just wanted to point out, not the only model in the US too, like encounter groups, I think, have been sort of influential in the way that some of these 12-step groups often run, and people have acknowledged that in the literature. So, there are lots of influences, I guess.
So you would say like the biggest aspect of the potential downsides of these groups is the standard boilerplate, which is that like people drop out over time as they lose enthusiasm or motivation or.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of families would have complaints, that it changes people's personalities,
Right.
And that they start to identify themselves in this way, like, maybe make being an alcoholic, let's say, so central to their identity. On the other hand, it's interesting that in Latin America, most evangelical churches also demand total abstinence from drinking. So it's not the only institution that's making that demand. It's interesting to think about why that is, and whether some people could, for cultural or personal reasons, modify themselves to not be addicted to or abusing alcohol, let's say, but just using it in moderation. And again, not qualified on any of that, but it's just interesting to note that AA really isn't asking something so strange, and maybe that's why it's had an easier time growing in Latin America. And I guess, yeah, so people, there are definitely complaints about support groups, but I think by and large, it's like Harriet was saying, there are such serious problems that men have, such serious behavioral problems, such serious violence. A lot of these stories and these interviews, they involved suicide attempts, like murder attempts, severe violence, a lot of times, which was like briefly like summarized or something. But they were difficult, interviews to do. Sometimes they'd last 3 hours, and people would cry, and, they were discussing the most difficult parts of their life. And, I didn't press or pry when I felt like it was, emotionally inappropriate. I'm not a therapist, but people were voluntarily sort of, given, this explanation of the research I was doing, and I explained, and of course, in these groups, I wasn't asking them to do anything they hadn't already done in these groups lots of times. So I also felt like I was just many times invoking the group setting and getting them to talk at length, which was interesting. I felt like I was able to get to know about people's intimate lives in this way that strangely didn't feel like exploitative or, this was something they would do at churches and in these groups. And so I wonder about that. I wonder about, what it is to change people emotionally so completely, where they can go from sort of a small town culture where people have expressions like small town, big hell or something, where there's like a sense of the gossip and that people are talking about you and commenting on, everything that you do, to joining a group where, because of the structure, let's say anonymity or confidentiality or whatever, you can sort of, or a church, you can sort of say the most intimate things about yourself, the things that you've done that you're the most ashamed of, and, get acceptance for that. So I think on the positive side, that I don't know that that's 100% good, but it's a big change emotionally in what people are willing to disclose about themselves. I don't know that that's all good because I don't know how to judge that. And it's not really my job a lot of times when I'm there to feel like I'm judging it. But, but it was just so interesting, to be able to experience and clearly with these men, and also get me to think about myself a little bit. It's changed me a lot, I think, to watch in a practice of mutual identification with people. People talk about their lives and like, I'm not separate from this. I'm able to access this group because I am a man and I've gone through a lot of these things, maybe not in their most severe forms. But it's maybe a lot of therapists could talk about this too. Maybe you have some experience, but it's not something I would talk necessarily about at length unless I felt like it was reciprocal to do so, in these settings. But yeah, it definitely changes you in a positive way. I would say all of this research, with the churches and the support groups that I studied had positive impacts on myself personally.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because it does have parallels with the Occupy thing and the Being a Man festival thing. It was just that someone created a space, a forum, and just like you said with your interviews, suddenly it sort of opens something up. Like you said, it's sort of essentially giving them a chance to tell you stuff. So sort of setting up a situation in which that's what is going to happen. It's kind of different from, going to work or driving a car or checking social media. It's like, okay, this is a space. This is what we're going to do. See what happens.
Well, I know. And that's, when you said that, I guess I didn't mean to interrupt. I wanted to ask if, what makes that the case when you say, someone set up a forum. I've heard some people talk about Occupy in terms of, the drive for consensus and not majority, the sort of egalitarian principles of the organization. When I was trying to think about this, I imagined it in terms of social organization and the norms and practices, and also the emotional content of these groups as being the decisive factors. But when I try to think about what makes, like you're saying, what makes these things possible, what makes the Man Festival or Occupy, what makes these support groups possible in ways that they aren't in other parts of life. And so I'd love to hear, y'all's thoughts on that, because I often wonder about that myself.
One thing is just time, I think. It's that, and maybe it's imagination. It's like, potentially it's just that it's not part of regular daily life. But, potentially I could get a table and chair and go sit up in the street and just be like, hey, this is man hour. Come and have a chat, There's no reason why I couldn't do that. And that would be kind of funny. But it's just that it's not sort of a culturally sort of regularity almost, or at least certainly in, my life experience up until those points, I guess. And I also think there's something really interesting I was listening to recently. It was a podcast about persuasion. I'll put it in the show notes, but the saying was that you can't reason someone out of something that they never reasoned themselves into something. And so the idea, probably what's happening with these spaces or support groups, is that they're not necessarily a place of reason, right? They're a place of, like you said, seeing yourself in others. It's sort of an emotional connection. And then through that process of processing the emotions, that's where things change. You don't sort of, that's why, stop smoking doesn't work, because it's like a reason thing opposed to a feeling thing. I don't know, Iko, if you have other perspectives on it.
I mean, one of the things that it's more of an observation, and I think also a potentially missed opportunity. But like I see a lot of shifts of masculinity that is happening through like institutions like churches and whatnot. That is a lot more religion based, and I think that having already that institutional structure makes it a lot easier. It gives it to a certain degree a more of a sense of familiarity for a lot of people. That like, I mean, it's not just some random group by random people, right? It's like people from church, or people there's a little bit of a connection that kind of eases people into.
Right. It doesn't raise the flag of like, has he joined a cult? Like,
is this like a flat out full on scam? I mean, all these things, there are certain aspects of like, I guess, authenticity and authority that comes from being associated or being favorably looked down by, or worked with by these institutions. Because they aren't separate from the church institutions, right?
Well, no, they are. They're completely.
They are, but it's not like they're oppositional too.
No. I think that's the interesting thing is that they. I suspected that at least some clergy, and some clergy did, see them as a different spiritual authority, like a different religious authority. But in fact, they seem to have come to see themselves as existing in like a complementary relationship, that there was something about public religion or the way the church was that doesn't appeal to men, but they still want to get men to come. And one of the ways to do this is to get them to go to these groups where they feel more comfortable. And a lot of men that do go to those groups end up coming to church more. And so over time, I think they don't see themselves, neither the Catholic churches nor the evangelical churches see themselves as in competition, even though there must be some sort of competition for time and attention, So, what just to your point about these things take time naturally. I've heard a lot of people describe more negative experiences in Occupy largely around this issue of like, and there we argued for 3 hours, and I mean reaching the consensus felt great at the end, but that it democracy a lot of time in action. So I think I think that's it. I think in the media too, men are getting in churches positive images of masculinity that aren't macho. At least that would be the term in this context. They would say machista, actually. Macho, and here's a funny thing, actually means blonde in Costa Rica. So they use the word machista to describe as an adjective form, or even a person, a person who's macho is a machista. But macho means blonde. And it's also used to describe male animals in general, like macho and hembra are like used to describe male and female of any animal a lot of times. So it's I mean, I thought of these groups as forming a special place, but like you're saying, Ikoi, I think they gain a certain authority or a certain acceptability by the fact that these churches have a positive relationship with them that is important to think about.
Because you are working with a lot of people, even if they're not necessarily religious. If you grow up in certain countries, you do grow up in a certain cultural a setting where being religious is a lot easier than completely not being one, and that it kind of still builds like your basic foundation worldview, so it doesn't necessarily contradict those things.
Yeah, and also that you could probably make an argument that we need institutions, and a lot of them are failing or have failed. Maybe that's just the state of sort of life all the time anyway. Maybe institutions are always failing, but because of, I guess, doomerism or capitalist realism, neoliberal policies, etc., it feels like all institutions are just, falling apart, and the religious thing, for all the sort of child sex abuse stuff that's happened over time, it's still there. Yes, dear listener, it's the moment you've been dreading. However, if we want to keep making this show, then we need cold, hard cash. So if you want an advert-free listening experience, come join our Patreon. Until then, endure this fairly innocuous advert for Spotify. Want to make a podcast?
Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere and even earn money, all in one place for free.
It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works.
Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer, so no matter what your setup is like,
you can start creating today.
Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify, and when you want to take conversations with your friends to the next level, Q&A and polls are the best way to get them talking. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's totally free with no catch. Ever since I discovered Spotify for Podcasters...
Personal statement example, I feel like having options like video podcasts and Q&A and polls has let me be creative on another level.
I highly recommend you give it a try.
Download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to spotify.com/podcasters to get started.
Well, when I read a lot of this, I was reading it through, you're talking about something like the thesis of bowling alone, that people are dropping out of, civil society institutions left and right, churches just being one example. And I read it also in the lens of this sociologist, Robert Wuthnow, who wrote about the restructuring of American religion through small groups and support groups. And there's this massive study with 1,000 different interviews and surveys where they did hundreds of different groups, and then tens of different, or 12 different ethnographic studies of different groups across North America. And one of the things that he sort of pointed out there was that people were, in fact, joining other groups, and there were some, so maybe the bowling alone thesis, that people were dropping out of everything, wasn't true. They were being replaced by these new groups, but it could be argued still that these groups lacked other things, that churches and these earlier groups had. And one is that these groups are focused on peerhood. I think peerhood is great for, a lot of forms of personal transformation, and maybe the place, as many of these groups argue, that people need to learn new behaviors that they can take out into the world and be, less of a machistic guy in your family, and all these relationships that they described at the beginning of this WEM group. And that is the goal. But one of the things that men described to me in their interviews about why they in turn went back and joined their old churches or joined new churches after, being members of these support groups was that, churches are like an intergenerational institution where you can take your family, but you can also see other families, and you celebrate the birth and death of other people in the congregation. And those are the kinds of institutions that, measurably are sort of failing and falling apart, bigger family units. And so it's interesting to me to think about that too, that, maybe something of what churches provide is still kind of organizational until you have something to replace churches that are, big enough that they contain multiple families, and you can sort of, pass through these life rituals of birth and death and people growing up and aging and maturing. And then it will be difficult to replace them entirely without, something that does that.
It's a great point. It's a really good point.
I don't know. I mean, there are perhaps other examples that people can think of, but
Dungeons and Dragons.
Transgenerational wisdom being passed on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's all on open license or something now, so it will forever be, something that generations can pass on, opposed to it being locked down with intellectual property right. But yeah, I think it's a really good point, and it sort of goes back. What's his name? Nassim Taleb, the guy who wrote Black Swan and Anti-Fragile and Skin in the Game. He's got that term, the Lindy Effect, which is if something's been around for 100 years, chances are it's going to be around for another 100 years. So religious institutions have been around for so long that they're not going anywhere anytime soon. And again, it comes back to that thing. It's like, well, even if you think religion is sort of bunk, it's like they have persuasive stories, clearly, because otherwise it wouldn't stick around. And again, going back to that podcast I was listening to, and something I was reading recently as well, it's like persuasion is more important than truth. And we had this guest recently, a doctor with the NHS, just talking about the state of it. And, for him, his method was to get out on social media, just tell the truth of what's happening inside the hospitals. Thing I was saying to him is like, I don't know if that's going to work, because I don't know if anyone cares about truth, right? And because mad shit tends to sort of fly on social media and in the news rather than facts. Facts are almost like boring. And so You need to, whatever, if there is going to be some future institution, like you said, that is going to mark these monumental moments of being a human being, it needs to be interesting. It needs to be persuasive. It needs to be fun. It's not like...
And emotionally engaging. I mean, I think that's the thing. In the 10 years that I went to Costa Rica, I watched the style of the Catholic Church, I think, respond to the changing styles of the evangelical churches, because the evangelical churches are bringing in these sound systems. I mean, they've not all got smoke machines and stuff, but they've got a band, like going on, and so it changed the style of the music of the Catholic Church. I feel like partly in a sense that, we've got to up the ante a bit and try to appeal to people on this emotional level. And music, of course, does that. The styles of music they played changed over time. And so I think, what you're saying, part of the power of those institutions is not just that they mark, their way of being human, but that they do it in a way that feels emotionally authentic, or maybe sometimes a little manipulative. I've seen the people like run these, make these decisions about what song to play next, and there is a theory behind it, but at the same time, people do we don't watch a TV show and say I was manipulated the whole way through. It's like, but that's what you signed up for, and at the same time, I think people, when they go to church, they wouldn't be horrified to learn that you had chosen songs that made them feel sad and then happy and then sad and happy, they would have felt like that was appropriate. That's what they were there for.
Yeah, there is a line, obviously, between persuasion and manipulation and all that kind of stuff. But if you watch a film, you're sort of willingly sitting down to be manipulated. If it's well done, you're going to go on this emotional roller coaster, but you chose to do it. And I guess, the cultural stuff, it becomes all that hegemonic stuff about you can go down that rabbit hole. Are these really your ideas? Are they really your emotions? Are they are you acting out what other people in power want you to act out, etc.? But just as a side, it's my upbringing. My mum was the one who went to work because her job was paying more at the time. So dad stayed at home, and then that just continued because mum's job was better paid, and so he was the sort of house husband. And this was in the 80s and 90s, right? So the whole thing of school pickup or anything like that, it's like there was maybe one other dad, and so I think there was a. I don't remember, but I don't think that there was like a whole bunch of, from what Dad had said, it wasn't like all the mums are like super welcoming, it's like you were the weirdo. Right. You're the weirdo guy. And, but I think it's changing very, very slowly, but there's a whole maybe podcast episode to do on that, like being that whole world of being a stay-at-home dad and all that sort of stuff. But it is sort of interesting how all these what are deemed acts of care are sort of looked down on, because that's the thing, right? Like everything happens or life continues because there is this background of care that's going on, and so we all sort of survive despite the economic system. Not because of it, right? Yeah.
I mean, one thing I've studied, like, communes and monasteries, and I'm really interested in like religious, like special institutions where you do things. And one of the things you see in a lot of religions as a transvaluation is the taking these things that are considered either lower caste or lower rank, or all these tasks of, if you've seen Game of Thrones, right? There's the scene where Sam goes to the watch and he has to clean all the soup and I don't want to bring it up, but it's this idea, I think, in a lot of religious traditions, that you take what was considered shameful or disgusting, or you take this disgust response and you learn that disgust is not morality. You learn that the disgust response feels like morality, and if we can train ourselves ethically, we might be able to train ourselves to feel disgust towards things that are truly, evil, but we can mistake very easily our disgust responses for morality, even though they're not. And if we undo that, if we hang out with lepers and learn how to touch lower caste people, and if we do all this, there's a real moral and ethical and like spiritual gain to be had by like going against that. And so when Harriet was talking about this, that's one of the things I was thinking of, was that in these groups, they're doing something that you see a lot of religions doing, which is teaching people that there's maybe even a zen, a joy, and like, I don't want to appropriate, that term, but maybe there's an aspect of like religious, like learning and practice through these mundane tasks of cleaning that, has gone unrealized because it's looked down upon. I don't want to get all spiritual about every time I clean a dish, but it's like there is a way in which
cleanliness is godliness, right?
There is a way in which they've always taught this, these religious things, that in fact that which we code as shameful and stuff is a natural and good and caring part of life. This caring work, it's actually maybe the best thing that we do,
Right.
Like that whole, that the original sign of civilization is the healed femur, that kind of thing,
Yeah.
The idea that this caring work is actually what we're so good at, and that humans, unlike a lot of primates, I mean, not to get biological or into biological anthropology here, but one of the things that is unlike other primates, except for maybe tamarins and marmosets, and Sarah Hurdy has, studied this, the mothers and others sort of research she does, that we're cooperative breeders. We both care for and feed one another's young, and almost no other primates do that. But a lot of dogs do that, and cats do that, and many like 9% of bird species, and of course there are social insects and stuff. But it's actually in the field that I belong to, but I think a lot of biologists would say too, one of the things that's best about us. And so there might just be something that we're connecting to in a lot of these religious traditions, where we just realize that society sort of inverts values on its own. And maybe over time we've looked at this caring and stuff as being like a way to exploit people and have all kinds of unpaid labor. But obviously taking care of your children is a beautiful thing. And, it doesn't always feel that way, but, like if you can keep the right mindset about it and not be just angry and tired all the time, there is a sort of beauty to it. So,
well, that's the real horror as well, isn't it? Of the way that men are supposed to be, is you disconnect them from potentially, like you said, the best bit of being a human being, which is care for yourself, care for others. And that's robbery. You sort of, and that's why you get suicide. That's why you get murder, because it's just a complete, maybe that's too a simple explanation, but you just get detached from the best part.
Yeah. A lot of, there's this thing going around the internet right now of this spoken word by this young black man saying most men are never, and it goes on and on, never experience acceptance. It's kind of unfortunate, because in this reaction video era, like a lot of, sort of conservatives will like be responding to this and sort of like reframing it in a different way than it was intended, but it is sad. What he's saying is true. It's just, I was struck by how popular it's become, and I have multiple accounts, like sock puppet accounts in different social media, because I try to eavesdrop on different, algorithms essentially, and like conversations that people are being exposed to. And part of this project, the new project I'm doing, also makes that very advantageous. But it's extremely popular in all kinds of political and cultural circles. So there seems to be a real awareness that that's happening. And I guess that's good, because I'm raising a young boy. And at least I think at the moment. And you worry that you want them to have positive images, and you try to be that for them. But, a father is not a total institution. They go out and exist in the world and experience the world like everyone else does. So you hope that there's a lot of positive images,
Yeah, the one everyone always resets to online is Aragon from Lord of the Rings. They're like, that's a positive. I'm like, the guy still kills people with a sword. It's not like he's. Whatever. It is. It does seem to be a thing. The conversations that are being had online, which is like, I guess it's a conversation that's had every generation. What are good role models? Because they do have an effect. They do make an impact, good or bad. There are role models that are just floating around out there. So, sorry, I don't have a succinct end for that. But equally, I don't know if you had any thoughts.
I had one last question, which is, how do you think what do you think, since we are leftist podcast, where do you think, the left is failing and succeeding in terms of masculinity?
Well, I would say there's two things. One is, I guess, images of masculinity, but I really, unfortunately, don't have anything clever to say about that. I do think that groups like this have been and could be used in leftist organizing. And I'm currently trying to drag half of an article out of a friend who's a sociologist in Spain. He lives in Barcelona. He has worked with PA, which is the anti-eviction group that films have been made about. There's actually a film called Si se puede in 7 Days with Pa. And that the organizer of Pa, Ada Colau, became the mayor of Barcelona. So it's a very successful and popular social movement. Basically, during the Occupy period, they were trying to evict people from their homes in Spain, and they fought against those evictions by having sit-ins. And in this film, 7 Days with Pa, one of the things they look at is the way that in the first part of these 7 days, they sit people down in what are essentially support groups, but they're about debt and the shame that people feel in being evicted from their home and like isolated and blamed. It's a bit like Graeber's work on debt, especially if people want to listen to the podcast version of that, because it's just easier to get through. There's a BBC series he did. In the first episode, he sort of talks about the way that debt is made to feel like your fault and you're sort of shamed and guilted. And I've seen this also in debt jubilee groups. Stephanie Kelton in one of these Vice videos where they're talking about debt jubilee groups is sitting in on essentially what looks very much like the same thing, where you get people to talk about the shame and of their debt situation, and within 7 days, as the video, the documentary suggests, they've got people doing sit-ins. They've essentially, I don't want to say socially engineered like strong bonds, but they've created strong social bonds between people in a very short amount of time by getting them to identify with one another and their problems and their emotional experiences. And there's something to this for organizing, I think. And a lot of the civil rights, like accounts of training people to do these civil rights actions involved them, imagining and play acting through the sort of abuses they thought they might face, so they didn't do the wrong thing. So there's a lot of, I think, organizing potential in getting people emotionally bonded and creating a strong sense of identity. And I think one of the things I heard maybe Liam allude to is that there are these strong emotional states that are elicited from learning to organize people in this way and organizing on these, norms and values. And if you can give people that experience, I'm not saying support groups are the only way to do that. I'm just saying it's interesting that in both the debt movement in videos that I've seen, one in particular that Vice put out in New York, and this anti-eviction movement, they both featured using this technique. And of course, it's also, had strong effects on people changing, very disordered behaviors like drinking obsessively. So, maybe there's something to it, not just for changing people's private lives and their own, relationship to the world and their family, but to, organizing people and getting them emotionally synchronized a bit.
Yeah, I do think, despite some of my criticisms with 12 steps, I think I always say that the benefit of those groups are specifically, every group has the potential of you running into manipulative people, exploitative people, right? You also have the chance of running into really good people as well.
Right. And a lot of people are very lonely, don't have any friends or connections or anybody they can talk to. I'm sort of struck by that. Obviously, when you talk to men, a lot of men are in that scenario.
A lot of people are in that scenario. And if you actually start defining friends, because that's such a loosely,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
That's like love, right? It's like, it's kind of like this broad shotgun of a word. But, once you start really defining friendships, like, a friendship is like, someone that you trust implicitly, that you can talk about the majority of, what you're going through or what you're feeling without having to censor yourself very much or at all. Right. If you say at all, then like vast majority of people say nobody.
Right. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like in the sense that a friend is something I don't want to say, it makes it seem instrumentalist to say you need a specific thing from them, but that is a very specific thing. And if you need that, if that's what it is to have a friend, then, I mean, obviously that's a positive thing about, if you can find the right group that doesn't violate other senses of other norms you have or your sense of personal autonomy or anything, it can be something that goes from like, I have 0 people that I can have this kind of discussion with to I have multiple people I can call in the middle of the night, and that's good for people's well-being, even if, in a lot of other ways we wouldn't consider it the same as friendship in other settings,
Right. I mean, it can be kind of, strangely powerful. Or not so strangely. Yeah, I mean, it was just one of those things where I remember getting a random phone call from a friend of mine at like 3 a.m, and then I'm a night owl. I'm usually up, and so I answered. And it was just kind of like this. You answered. I wasn't expecting. I was going to leave a rambling voicemail. Because I just needed to get something off my chest. But you answered, and it was just one of those things where, like, when they hung up, before they hung up, they were like, I really feel loved.
Nice.
Yeah.
And for me, I was just like, I just happened to be up, so I fucking answered the phone, So, like, on my end, it didn't feel like that big of a deal.
I do think that emotionally, the effect of no one picking up their phone, it can't be easy for a lot of people, I'm sure, that are in like a rough spot.
Yeah. So, I just remember how genuine that statement was, before they said night, right? That like, I really feel loved right now, and how sometimes like these simple gestures can really mean a lot, especially when it's consistent over time.
Yeah, I don't know if it's male socializing or I'm just a arsehole, but if someone had said that to me, I'd have said like, well, you shouldn't, and then I'd hung up. Then I would send a text going, jokes, love you too, something like that,
right. Are you uncomfortable with intimacy, Liam? Do we have a problem here?
Well, if Harriet was here, she might know. George Vaillant is a guy that works on addiction and a number of issues at Harvard. He ran for many years the Grant study, which is, I think, the longest run longitudinal, social experiment, like social study, where they followed these people for now like 70 years. And he wrote a book called The Triumph of Experience about like his experience running that. But he also wrote a lot about alcoholism and some of the counterintuitive aspects of addiction from that point of view. But he was one of the people to say, the long-term impact of being in these groups, is hard for me to accept and swallow, because there's a lot of things I don't like about them, essentially. But he says, one of the things that makes them not work for men that have, maybe like Liam and I both have, if you have a certain class training and background, is like, this is a big part of it. This is also very much a class thing. You do not expose yourself emotionally, and you certainly are like enthusiastic and, along certain lines. He said, men basically that had enough education, like formal education, would not want to join these groups and would not have any of the benefits. And therefore, you could almost class was a strong predictor of not recovering from alcoholism in these studies, because, they could not let their guard down enough to have the kind of connections they needed with people to keep from drinking. And these groups these groups were just like distasteful to them. And I experienced this a lot in Latin America. There are a lot of people like, oh, gross, you study support groups? Like I could never, and there was this attitude like that. They just stand there and talk about their problems. These are men, they just couldn't.
Right.
It seems so, but especially along class lines, there was this finding in George Vaillant's study, and I definitely experienced that I lived in a kind of a rural area. Like, I think if I'd done this study in a more urban area, I would have encountered a lot more resistance along those lines, because that's what he found as well,
Right. Right. There can definitely be a class factor in like the lack of intimacy. that is prevalent in our society. I think it's kind of like, yeah, one of the major things that I'm seeing in socialization in general, and especially around like the the psychology, like pop psychology bleeding into socialization is like, you'll see terms like, oh, somebody trauma dumped on me and I don't understand why they're talking to me. They need to go talk to a therapist. Right. And especially when like this person is quote unquote a good friend.
Right.
It's one of those things where like, what's a good friend if they can't like be upset and call you?
Yeah, it's weird. I wonder about like the creation of terms for stuff. I heard comedians talk about this recently, like breadcrumbing and love bombing, and the extent to which it was describing people's like experience. Like, are these manipulations actively a lot of the times, or is it just people being kind of flaky and like sending some messages and then not sending some messages, or like, or even maybe having like serious life stuff that means that they just stop sending messages to people for a sec,
right. Or just, it's just one of those things where it's just like a lot of times, I think when it comes to things like, ghosting or, a lot of communication issues is a lot of times people are overwhelmed and they're not consciously doing these things.
Right.
Or it's not like an obvious intent of like, I'm going to fuck up this person's day in life today. Haha.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of it is just like, oh, like, I like, for example, I remember a friend of mine calling me up and she was just like, yeah, like, this guy that I've gone on a few dates with, right, seems like he's having like a lot of, major big issues in his life, like it was one of those things where I guess like, he had like multiple family deaths and whatnot. And she was just like, yeah, like, I just feel like he doesn't really have like justifiably the time to kind of pursue a relationship. And his thing has been like really, because communication has been really spotty, right? So she was just like, yeah, like, I think I'm just going to call it off. But I kind of also don't want to call him up when he's having all these problems and be like, I'm dumping you on top of this.
Right. I just want to make it official. Like, we haven't talked in a while, but
Yeah. And so it was one of those things where she was going back and forth and she was just like, yeah, like, I was kind of thinking about just like letting it fade because, his inconsistent communication, I think, is just like sign enough, and then like, yeah. And so it was one of those things where she was telling me like, one person was like, oh no, you have to call and you can't just text, you have to call and tell him in person or otherwise you're a piece of shit. Right. And like another person was just like, oh, that's just manipulative on his part to not be communicating consistently, and so it's kind of interesting how so many people would, view the same situation and come out with very different things on top, right? But yeah, like it was one of those things where I just remember that conversation because she was just like, oh, like, I just wanted to talk to you because now I'm so confused after talking to my other friends that I need another
There's
friend.
There's no consensus about how to interpret this.
Right. How to like unpack everything here, and I just remember like, listening to the entire conversation because, a lot of those like pop psychology terms were getting kind of bandied about. And, I'm also like pretty guilty of using a lot of these terms myself. But, ultimately it's one of those things where the one aspect of like, I think, the middle class thing has been that now like therapy has kind of replaced close personal intimacy in certain ways of like, oh, you're supposed to go to a therapy for those conversations.
And I think about that too, because my wife and I, like our insurance, our present, we have Kaiser and we will probably switch, at some point, but, doesn't cover like marriage therapy, and a lot of plans don't, but they'll cover individual therapy. And I think about that because it must be the case that like, we've gone to, sort of as a regular sort of informal gift to ourselves and each other. We have a person that we check in with, and then, if we're having a difficult time or facing a hard decision, we'll talk with more often. And it's been great. I mean, we just kind of were lucky because we had a good recommendation maybe. And we sort of liked what we perceived about the person initially. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting that we treat these problems all individually. Like it's every person's like sole individual to take care of themselves, and not like families or couples, that should be like checking in with somebody, and to make sure everyone's treating everyone, well, and that the communication is happening. Because, it must be that a lot of therapists are sitting there like, I wonder what the other person would say about this. I can't ask them, directly. But I mean, I wonder how you feel about that, Ikoy. Like, do you think a lot of therapy, if you could accomplish it, would be better? I mean, in group settings, but is it insurance? Is it the culture of it? I wonder why people.
I think I don't necessarily like groups are hard.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think there is a benefit to groups and there are benefits to individual therapy. And I don't think that they are, they can be conflated because they do different things.
Yeah.
Right. Like group isn't.
So you're saying I should see a therapist on my own as well.
I mean, generally speaking, it depends on, I mean, one, like, if there are, like, if you don't have any major issues that you want to really work on in therapy, then there's no reason for you to see an individual therapist, right? If like the only reason that, you're looking to get any kind of therapy is specific to like improving your marriage, for example.
Yeah. Well,
right?
it's such an important relationship, but obviously, you have young kids. There's a lot of stress running
There's
around
a lot
the
of
house.
stress, and just time and all these things. So, I mean, and yeah, I mean, like again, like a lot of these I don't necessarily think group is better than individual. I think they're both important, but with the exception of couples therapy, right? Because or family therapy, right? I would say that like individual counseling is probably going to be more bang for your buck than group.
Yeah. Ian Parker, one of the co-authors of Psychoanalysis and Revolution, he was saying the mistake in thinking that just one-on-one therapy is just you, is false. Is that ultimately there's more people in the room than just you and the therapist, right? Because you're bringing in all the relationships that are troubling
Absolutely.
you. So like even in one-on-one, really, it's sort of invisible group therapy, right? It's you having these arguments with these people in your head.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's just that you don't necessarily have to deal with, overt personality conflicts and issues with other group members.
Right.
That you in group therapy, because the vast majority of complaint in group therapy is that if somebody in the group really rubs you the wrong way, you can actually turn that into like a therapeutic thing for people, but that doesn't always necessarily happen. If you have issues like social anxiety, groups can be extremely stressful for some people.
Right.
So
or anger issues, if people have, I imagine.
Right. Or, I mean, if they have like, emotional regulation issues, right, where
Right.
they're bound to kind of like, get set off and shoot off at people, that can be really tough to manage in group settings. So there's, a group therapy. When it works out great, it works out great. When it doesn't, it can really be tough. But yeah, ultimately there can be a certain. And again, this also just depends on the relationship you have with your therapist, right? Because if you really feel like you can't tell your therapist certain things, then, there's no value in that therapeutic relationship ultimately. But so, the benefit of group therapy is that, sometimes if you take a more passive stance, you still can get a lot out of it from listening.
That was something that a lot of men described, that, when you come to the groups and you listen initially, 4 or 5 times a lot, before you're asked to, share very much other than your name, at least the group that I looked at. But then a lot of men said, over time, I don't really share. I'll share when I think my sharing is going to help someone who has just come and decided to there, but the majority of what they're gaining is listening, and there is this way I wonder sometimes, if and I wonder, if you have thoughts on this, but it's just that people have lots of defenses from seeing themselves. Hopefully, after a lot of therapy or a lot of practice, you could recognize those defenses when they pop up. But there is something strange about being able to see someone else's problems in a way that we sometimes have difficulty seeing our own problems or seeing ourselves the way that other people see us.
Right.
And a lot of people describe that it was partly that it caught them off guard, that they identified, they're taught, like, I don't identify with anybody, and then, suddenly somebody tells a story and like, oh my God, that happened to me. I've never talked to anybody about it, So I wonder sometimes about the ability of, it's like TV, or like when there's this thing where you feel like artificially safe for something, because, but then you can get emotionally sort of triggered. And people describe this a lot, that listening was actually the therapeutic thing. And then also you see this at church, you see this at churches too. I've gone to churches, and, when you're on the regular, like every week or so, hearing about who's got cancer and how it's progressing, and whose funeral is coming, and who's got the birth of a new child, and who's, being baptized, and all this kind of stuff. I don't want to say it relativizes your problems, but and I don't really want to imply that the answer for people that have lots of difficulties is just not stop focusing on themselves. Obviously, that's not true. They need to focus on themselves in a lot of important ways. It's just that sometimes people do get a bit in their own head about their problems, and the feeling that their problems are so unique, and that it's so shameful, and no one could understand what they're going through, and they could never talk about it. That going to a group sometimes has this effect of like, oh, I'm not so strange. In fact, my problems are kind of tame compared to that guy.
Right.
Right.
I mean, it can give you, a sense of relation to other people, but two, it can also give you a sense of perspective that way, right? Whether it's, like maybe I really do have a serious problem, or, that, oh, wow, like, this thing that had mushroomed into my head as such a big deal it maybe isn't, is something that's manageable. Things like that, so there are definite benefits to group therapy, but again, group therapy is one of those things where I think in order for it to be beneficial, oftentimes it should be run well. And I guess that's true with all therapy in general, is that it really does need to be run well to be successful, but it can be a difficult thing to stay on track and manage various different conflicts and personalities that pop up within groups.
There was a meme, a tweet the other day that I saved. The most selfish person you know is at therapy being told they're allowed to be selfish sometimes. and so like this idea that through the group thing, that listening is the thing, opposed to just talking about your own particular stuff. It sounds, makes sense, kind of profound.
Right. I mean, there is that element of one of the issues that you will find in some group settings is that, people will want to dominate all the attention, and so when people, because I've heard that little tweet more than once. And every time I think of that tweet, I think of people who are just won't allow people to get a word in.
Do you ever have I'd read this thing about a traffic light system with speech, essentially that when someone starts speaking, there's a green light, they should be getting to their point, it's a yellow light. And then if they just keep going, it's like red light, this person needs to be sort of shut down. But I'd read that not necessarily in a group therapy context, but just in a sort of general day-to-day sort of sociability thing. I was like, that's a cool idea. Is that something that turns out?
That is definitely people can completely derail and again not mendaciously, right, but just through the process of talking about something, and it's all kind of individual assessment as a facilitator of whether this is a valid or a valuable kind of, derailing, or whether this is kind of disruptive, or basically just not going anywhere. And also, like, because this is a group, you do want to give other people opportunities to talk. So, there are times when I will make the intervention of, like, I think we are veering off topic since you're veering into this topic. What do you think?
You never like sigh out loud and go, oh, God. Shut up.
Liam, I would love it would kind of actually be hilarious, to do a skit of, like, where you're like the oblivious wrong therapist.
That would be a lot of fun, actually. What every therapist is really thinking, or something like that,
Right, you can become the face of bad therapy.
Yes, I do have a charmed position on this podcast in that I'm not that, and so I can poke fun at it, I guess.
But it is. I mean, these are things that you constantly. I mean, these are things that you have to work with, in individual sessions as well. Because there are times when, like, clients will start talking about a subject and then derail, start talking about, and when people do that, like, consistently, it's like, okay, like, it really seems like you're avoiding this topic.
Right. And that becomes information. Yeah.
So and everything is information, because a lot of times people are critters of habit and pattern.
Well, this has been, it's been super interesting to reflect on this, because this is research, of course, not my most recent research. And, I'm writing a book about this, but when you are doing something like looking at a support group, it's clear you're thinking to yourself, okay, I got a minor in psych. I was trying to double major, and then the scholarship office kind of got hip to the fact that I didn't really need a ninth semester. And I've always sort of been enamored of, but never practiced psychology. So you feel a little bit amateurish when you're in these groups, in one case, in one of the groups, there actually are therapists present. But, so it's difficult for me a lot of times to judge these things. And it's been interesting to hear people that have worked in therapy, both in a group and individual context, reflect on the strengths and the weaknesses of it, as a therapeutic practice. And also, just the perspective of somebody who'd be far more likely to be observing that. So it's been super, helpful for me as well to have that conversation, because I often think, well, whose opinion I really like about on this is, somebody who's actually trained to think about it. So, it was fun research. I don't just want to say fun. It was very emotional and engaging research to do, and to, spend time with these men and get to know them and hear their stories. But it's always great to sort of reflect upon it with people that have like more of a capacity to do that than I came to the table with. So I appreciate that. It's also been nice to think about this in terms of the left, angle. So I appreciate that as well. I went there.
I think we're missing a huge opportunity.
Oh, well, I think that all the time. I mean, this is sort of my personal hobby horse to wail on, which is that, I have positive views of religion, which a lot of people on the left do not. Not to say universally positive, obviously, but I mean, there's quite a lot to complain about. But I also. I know that group therapy is not seen positively by not only, mostly in certain parts of positive, in popular culture. So I feel like an amateur advocate for things that I'm not really, maybe fit to be a representative of. But I do feel like what you're saying is true. Like, there's things going on in these therapeutic contexts that people are describing also with Occupy, and a lot of this organizing that my friend, for instance, in Spain has been talking to me about, that, we're missing some of the emotional power of these institutions, because people aren't just going to organize politically, without it, so whatever it is that
it's much harder. It's much harder to organize politically without
some emotional.
Yeah. Without certain things.
You gotta have something to believe in, right? There's got to be a sort of direction of travel. There's got to be the catalyst, the fire to want to do things, and believe that it can change, not just sort of do it and just be like, oh, we're all going to die. It has to be like towards something better. And, religion to some degree solves that by like, hey, you're not going to die. Everything's going to be fine afterwards. And there was an interesting economics lecture I watched recently where he was saying that there was this period in time before you have like the rise of economic productivity, and that the people who were in charge of everything, the landlords and the kings or whatever, squandered the money. They wasted it. They didn't put it back into production, but what they did invest in was God. And as soon as sort of God as a concept was challenged to the degree that it was, that's when the sort of economic growth thing took off, for better or worse, I guess. But it's interesting, isn't it, that maybe that also maybe why debt was such an inspiring subject, because it's tied to identity. But, money is tied to opportunity and a future and all that kind of stuff. If you show people...
I mean, money is tied to your value as a person.
Yeah.
Right. The meritocracy is ultimately about economics. Yeah. I mean, I just think, there is this aside from the religion part, because I'm somebody that is absolutely not a fan of religion, but, I will begrudgingly and happily admit that there are some key advantages to organizing.
They got some good songs as well.
Yeah. When it comes to religion, I just think, it's one of those things where ultimately, like, one of the, things that I've always hated about religion is kind of like, like you always have your church ladies, although it's not just women, it's heavily men as well. On the left, there are way too many people that have very similar, like, moralistic attitudes that are more about, like, berating people rather than helping people.
Right.
Nobody likes the church ladies. The church itself is fine. I mean, not the church itself is fine per se, but that, the whole concept of churches and religion isn't necessarily a bad one.
Yeah, the feeling that you're being watched, right? Is it always...
Yeah, but it's one of those things where, like, I think one of the benefits of these groups that you talk about is that you are actually, telling, you are trying to, give people like, hey, like, you have the ability to change. You do have, that, you can be different, right? And kind of helping people be, the process of change, be there for their process of change, and that is a really important human thing to do.
Yeah.
Right. And maybe a way too that, would be inappropriate for a therapist to provide this kind of support. Like, they can't, maybe you can't be someone's therapist and their buddy who's encouraging them to do therapy. You know what I'm saying? Whereas...
Right. Well, I mean, again, like, you can't call up your therapist at 2 a.m. You're just going to get a fucking voicemail.
Yeah.
Right. And they're just going to be like, well, I don't have an opening for another 2 weeks. Will Thursday at 4 p.m. for an hour work for you? Right.
Well, there's also that credentialized stuff, and you spoke about that in the past as well. Just that, William, you're sort of saying like, there's some maybe trepidation just being like, oh, well, I'm not a therapist, so I don't necessarily feel whatever when you were talking to all these men. But at the same time, it's like maybe the credentialization of everything is the best case scenario is it's just about some sort of guarantee that you're not supposed to have like a terrible advice or a terrible experience. But clearly, if you look at some of the guests on this podcast or just read any of these kind of places online, people are having terrible therapy, with fully credentialized people. So
yes,
it's like
all the time.
Yeah, all the time. And the worst version of the credentialized thing is it's just authority, it's just hierarchy, and then you're sort of encouraged to bow to it. And so that idea of the group being at best an egalitarian space where you learn with each other is good.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing that I found myself, on the political side, when I was like, I'm studying, like, they're trying so hard to do egalitarianism. Like, I've never seen a group try so hard, not that it was always perfect, and there was a certain dogma, obviously, and I mean, there were different layers to it, I guess, but yeah, that was one thing that I thought was sort of striking about. And there is I described it in an article that I'm resubmitting now as like a laicization. There's a way where they're not attacking the credentialization of therapy. And many of them, if they could afford it, I'm sure would see therapists, and like I said, in one of the groups, but there is a weird parallel between what's going on with evangelicalism, where you pull away from the authority of the church and its credentialing process. And sort of some of your pastors are credentialed and some of them are just some guy that's been reading the Bible for a bit, So, there are different attitudes, but attitudes against, let's say, the professionalization of religious authority or therapeutic authority or whatever. So I don't want to emphasize that. That's really more something I find interesting than I think most of my interlocutors would raise. This is my fundamental concern, to dethrone, therapy. And that's not, that's definitely not what they're doing. But it's just, I just found that strange too. As a model of authority, it seems both weirdly Protestant in this way, in parallel to what's going on in Latin America in the religious sphere, and then also, it's sort of questioning hierarchical authority as at least as necessary for certain kinds of therapeutic development. So I found that interesting.
Yes, and I actually have one more random question has anything in the immortality sphere brought up anything that reminded you of the masculinity?
Well, yes. When I started studying masculinity, I actually thought about comparing 3 gyms because I am seeing the growth in this, one of the gender changes that's happening is, men's growing attention to their bodies and that being, something that had largely been insisted upon of women. But, not that men had nothing to perform, visually, but there's this I'm seeing in the town that I live in, which is urbanizing. I studied this town because sociologists and political scientists had studied it for its rapid change in economic sectors and its rapid rate of growth in this area. And I was noticing a lot of these very quick urbanization trends, and this stuff about the body and care for the body in men and the attention to their body and trying to maintain and perfect a certain aesthetic reminded me a lot of the masculinity stuff. I just didn't pursue that route when I ended up studying men's groups. But yeah, I'm noticing a lot of this. I've been taking part in some of the practices. Like I said, I've been doing intermittent fasting and the cold exposure baths because that's stuff that they do. And,
you and me both, minus the cold exposure. I don't do cold.
Yeah. Yeah, so I've been doing it, and that's interesting, because I do see the other thing that men are doing, is they're starting to think maybe I should take care of myself too, maybe I don't have to be totally vain about it, to want to, eat well and take care of my body a little bit better and stuff. So this teetotaling, this lack of drinking and evangelical and religion and also AA and stuff is in some ways part of a broader, I think, turn towards men not treating their bodies just as tools and starting to treat them as an integral and valuable part of themselves. So,
yeah, I definitely would like to explore that whole subject as well in another podcast. The fitness stuff is sort of fascinating because I feel like a lot of it is aligned politically. Not necessarily with the left, in terms of the gym bro stuff, because it's right. All about so aligned with me and my self-improvement and look at the gains that I've made that it's sort of, individualism literally on steroids, right?
Right. Well, yeah, it's yeah. I mean, the left kind of went through a weird lifting phase. Do you remember that, William?
Yeah. I don't want to claim to have, yes.
I don't claim to have intimate knowledge of that, but it was more a lot more powerlifting rather than going to the gym to lift weights kind of thing. But yeah, it was one of those things where it's just that's interesting that, a fairly high, lifting heavy weights does have a certain level of risk associated with it, right?
Right. And I saw it with the CrossFit thing, people could hurt themselves, obviously. The idea, what I often find behind these health trends is just that there's some core or idea that's being expressed to some degree that's unhealthy, but that if you reined it in, you could perhaps get some gain from something they're pointing out. Like, for instance, that a lot of the exercises you do on some machine in the gym are not going to be really functional for you in everyday life. So maybe you should try to do something more functional. Maybe you don't need to pretend you're living in the Paleolithic, but maybe your balance of carbohydrates to other parts of your diet is just a little off. Like a lot of there's some core truth to it that people are sort of exploiting and sort of taking. Like the liver man, I'm sure you heard about this in the past few months.
Liver
right?
king.
Liver king, right? Liver king. I mean,
Right.
that's what I see is that, like I definitely see what Liam's seeing. There's certainly a lot of negative social effects, but in this way I see it like religion, it's like, yeah, certainly. I mean, there's tons of negative religious stuff going on, but the core of what some people are trying to do, and often what I've noticed, studying ethnographically institutions like churches, is that your eye gets drawn to like the most dramatic thing. That's just the way our cognition works, and so the person who's wailing the loudest or singing the loudest at church, who's like running around, throwing themselves against the wall at some Pentecostal church, that person's really going to catch my attention. But I need to do something sociological a bit, step back and say, okay, yeah, but that's literally like not even a percentage of the people in here, so so like, I'm not saying like, for instance, that gym bros are a negligible part of like, the part of people's attention to, their diets and lifting and stuff like that. I'm just saying that I'm sure that for every gym bro, there's at least one person who's like, I'm going to start doing resistance training because my doctor said it's going to improve my bone density or blah, blah, blah,
I think there's loads of people like that, and they're just like a bit put off by the gym. And this is it links to this subject as well that Iko and I have spoken about. I think Iko, you came up with a phrase, which was just that self-improvement shouldn't be left to the right wing. Like, there is a version of self-improvement that is, for everyone.
Well, I mean, that's important, right? That we, that's called growth. And that's what, that's the whole purpose of living in some ways, is that, not that you attain perfection or that you attain an ideal, but like, you constantly challenge yourself to change.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is partly what happens is that on the one hand, the left wants to be inclusive and so acknowledge that like we can't just go around telling everybody to improve. A lot of people are not in a position to be able to. So there's like a reluctance to want to feel like you're pressuring people in any way to improve.
Good point.
And also to feel like you're being exclusivistic, like about disabled people, about X, Y. So there's quite a lot of energy, and that's important. And you'd only want to be a part of a movement that paid some attention to that. But then on the other hand, you do feel like when you see all these Jordan Petersons and people floating around, that a good part of the vacuum that's being filled is around self-improvement and the desire, especially of young men, to do some of it, and the lack of maybe alternative voices or voices that are appealing or whatever, the lack of that, because that's certainly part of what's going on, is like a lot of these people had never had any, there's this whole thing about clean your room, in Jordan Peterson, that it's like, maybe that's more his earlier, stuff, but there was a big, there's a big part of it that's like clearly people are lacking. I lacked, my parents got divorced and I lacked a male authority, person or a person who was a role model or a guide for a period of time. So I don't mean to lament too hard on this topic, but yes, it shouldn't just be the left shouldn't cede anything to the right. It shouldn't cede religion. It shouldn't cede, self-improvement. I mean, anything that's worth doing in human life, you can't just, say we don't do that. That's right wing,
Yeah. I mean, certainly I find the exercise thing, obviously it's sort of dished out almost like a torture for people that it's something you should be doing. But if you can find a way in that you actually want to do, and who knows where that motivation comes from, but for me, it's definitely essential. It's like I need to do something because it is a way of staying buoyant, like at its most basic, makes me feel good. So, and
I mean, we are creatures that were meant to not be sedentary.
Well, and I mean, isn't there, I think about like people's love for like look, I'm not a tanky. I'm not, promoting, Sino or Soviet eras of, state propaganda. But there was a thing about the proletarian imagery of a lot of that stuff that also was clearly designed to appeal to men, in the imagery.
Of strong men, right? Strong proletarians.
And strong women. I mean, there were a lot of
strong women as well.
Yes, that was the thing. It was the idea that you could have strength of any race, of any gender, but
right.
Well,
I mean, I remember all the kind of, now it would be like misogynist slants, transphobic jokes back in the Cold War days during the Olympics about like the Eastern German and like the Russian or the USSR athlete women, right? Are they really women?
Right.
That was kind of constantly floating around back then.
Because they were just strong and good at what they did.
Yeah. And that was, I think, again, like, fundamentally a lot of, people get traumatized because, very rarely like exercise and the relationship to exercise isn't just like, about physical movement, but a lot of emotional underpinnings to a lot of that. It's not like people are lazy, or it's not like, people just want to, sit around and,
well, in
feel
school,
terrible.
And again, maybe this is a bit of a stuck record from my perspective, but school can put you off that stuff. Like PE,
absolutely, huge.
Physical education lessons could be, absolutely a sort of emotional minefield.
Right.
Depending on the sport and the vibe.
Yeah, and pressure can definitely have the opposite effect of a lot of people.
Yeah.
I've had friends, whose parents sent them over to like, they called them fat camps back then during the summer, where it was like diet camps, right? When they were teenagers, and like, listening to like a lot of their experiences around family, around food and around, movement and around exercise and all these things, it's like if you start associating all those things with pleasing everyone else but yourself, of course you're not going to want to do it.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Yeah. And I definitely didn't really sort of do regular exercise until I was not being forced to. It's like discovering it myself, and that was a really important thing. It was this individualism, I guess, but it was mine, right? Like I wasn't being forced to. I wanted to, because it was positive in its outcomes and stuff like that. But then, there's also a part of my brain that was programmed as a kid to like, man, I want to be like the Thundercats or the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but that didn't really kick in until my 30s. So, hello, therapist.
I mean,
why is that? Yeah. But
ultimately, a lot of these, one of the major issues within it, whether it's like, if you think about it, whether it's gender or whether it's health, is that like, you have, on one hand, you have people that are promoting these very strict, narrow ideals, right? Whether that's gender or health, and then you have another group saying, that sucks, right? Fuck you. Which is fine, but it's also one of those things where, again, like so many conversations end up with two extremes talking at each other with very little to offer for people as like a real solution, right? So a lot of times, you do have like all these fitness guys and women as well that are just like, you lazy bastards, get your ass up, Go work out, right? And then you have, understandably, you have, if you want to be considerate of people, you say, well, that's not necessarily helpful.
No.
But then you don't have a whole lot of like, what is actually helpful? That is helpful.
Well, the thing is, again, it's this identity thing and what group you belong to or don't. And, it's like someone like Henry Cavill, you know, the guy who played Superman, ties this thing perfectly together. It's like, here's a guy who's jacked and he likes painting models, figurines, you know, plays Warhammer. And it's like, yeah, why can't these different things that operate in different universes be combined? Why can't you enjoy exercise and also sort of nerd out on particular things? Instead, there's this sort of like pressure to just identify with, like, I am just this and I am not doing anything else.
There is a very narrow ideal and nothing else, right? You know, like to this day, you'll constantly hear, you know, women go like, oh, like, you know, is working out going to make me muscular like a man?
Yeah, it's mad though, because it takes a lot. It takes a lot to build muscle.
It's one of those things where, like,
so
do you understand
like,
all the work that the guys do to actually get to that point? You know, but again, you know, I've also talked about how we, you know, none of us are really ever taught how to understand our bodies, much less our emotions, right? How to actually like operate as a human being isn't part of the educational system.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, we should end it there because it's nearly
Yes.
3 hours, and that was a pretty good place to end.
Cool. Well, thanks, Liam, Ikoi. Great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right,
Take care.
take care. See you later. Bye.